Hey y'all, my name is Katie Rice, and today for my Marshal project I will be presenting over McCulloch versus Maryland. So to begin with, some of the case facts. This case was, the Chief Justice on this case was John Marshall, the defendant was McCulloch, and the plaintiff was the state of Maryland. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States, and in 1818, the state of Maryland passed legislation to impose taxes on the Second Bank of the United States. The cashier of the Baltimore branch of the bank, James McCulloch, refused to pay the tax that the state of Maryland placed on the bank. The case was brought to the state appeals court, which held that the Second Bank was unconstitutional because the Constitution did not provide a textual commitment for the federal government to charter a bank. The case was argued from February 21st, 1819 to March 3rd, 1819, and was formally decided on March 6th, 1819. So, some background on this case. The establishment of a national bank of the United States was a source of great public controversy starting the moment the Constitution was ratified. Now, in 1789, President George Washington's Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, proposed creating a national bank in order to regulate American currency and deal with the national economic hardships. Washington's Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, strongly opposed the creation of a national bank due to fear that it would seize the power of the states and concentrate too much power in that of the federal government. Despite Thomas Jefferson's concerns, Congress created the first Bank of the United States in 1791 with a 20-year charter. The issue of a national bank continued to spark public controversy even following its establishment. Those supporting the bank eventually formed the Federalist Party, while those who were more focused on states' rights and did not want the bank to be formed, they became the Democratic-Republican Party. The first bank's charter expired in 1811 and was not renewed. However, the country had some economic problems following the War of 1812, which prompted Congress to pass legislation in 1816 founding the Second Bank of the United States. The United States government only owned 20% of the bank's equity, and many state governments resented the bank for calling loans it had made to them. Because of this, some states passed laws in order to hinder the bank's operation, while others tried to tax it. In 1818, Maryland's state legislature passed a law taxing any bank operating in Maryland that was not chartered by the state of Maryland, $15,000 annually. The only bank fitting this description was the Second Bank of the United States. James William McCulloch, the head of the Baltimore branch of the Second Bank of the United States, refused to pay the tax that was placed on the bank. The case was appealed to the Maryland Court of Appeals, where the state of Maryland argued that the Constitution did not speak on the subject of banks. Maryland's Court of Appeals ruled that without specific constitutional authority for the federal government to create a bank, any such creation would be unconstitutional. The case was then appealed to the Supreme Court. So, the two main questions surrounding this case are: 1, did Congress have the authority to establish the Second Bank of the United States? And 2, did the Maryland law unconstitutionally interfere with congressional powers? So the Supreme Court's decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress had the power to create the bank. Chief Justice Marshal supported his decision with 4 main arguments. First, he argued that historical practice established Congress's power to create a bank. Marshall used the creation of the first bank in order to defend the constitutionality of the second bank. Second, Marshall rebutted the argument that states retain ultimate sovereignty because they ratified the Constitution. Marshall instead argued that it was the people who ratified the Constitution. Therefore, It was the people, not the states, who were sovereign. Third, Marshall addressed the scope of congressional powers under Article I of the United States Constitution. Marshall admitted that the Constitution did not explicitly give Congress the power to create the bank, but also stated that it is not dispositive as to Congress's power to establish such an institution. Fourth, Marshall supported his argument by invoking the Necessary and Proper Clause, which permits Congress to pass any legislation it deems necessary as long as it doesn't strictly violate the Constitution. Maryland argued that the word necessary meant Congress could only pass laws that were absolutely essential in the execution of its enumerated powers. The court rejected this argument, stating that many of the enumerated powers of Congress under the Constitution would be completely useless if only laws deemed essential to a power's execution could be passed. Marshall also pointed out that the Necessary and Proper Clause was listed under Congress's powers, not its limitations. Marshall also determined that Maryland could not tax the bank without violating the Constitution because the power to tax involves the power to destroy, as quoted by Marshall. The court struck down the tax as an unconstitutional attempt by a state to interfere with a federal institution in violation of the Supremacy Clause. This case was a great demonstration of the balance between state and federal powers, a concept known as federalism. Marshall also established that the Necessary and Proper Clause does not strictly require all federal laws to be necessary and proper. This reinforced Congress's ability to pass legislation without strictly deriving their power directly from the Constitution. And I think this will be the end of my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed and learned something. And yeah, thank you for listening.